Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our noon webinar focused on Massachusetts policy. We have a lot to cover, so we'll just go ahead and get started. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we work for a nonprofit called Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We do that by running a series of programs and services that help people access clean energy technologies, but we complement that with a lot of policy advocacy at the state level. My name is Anna Vanderspeck. I run our electric vehicle program, Drive Green, and also do transportation advocacy work, and I will let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Kai. I am the policy coordinator and I work on buildings and electricity policy in Massachusetts and Rhode Island.
So today we have a fun-filled hour through Massachusetts policy advocacy. We will start with a general timeline of where we are in the legislative session and what to expect from the next couple of months. Then we'll have a couple sections that focus specifically by topic, so starting with electricity and buildings and then moving on to transportation. We'll cover some next steps and ways that you can get involved, and we'll end with open time for questions. So through the whole webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and then at the end we'll sort through and answer them as best we can. So moving right along to the timeline. We are right now almost in June, mid-May, and the legislative session ends on July 31st of this year, 2022. But there are a couple things that have happened this spring and are still going to happen between now and the end of the session that are really important for this conversation. So the first is that in March, the Massachusetts House passed an act advancing offshore wind and clean energy. And that bill is pretty much does what the title describes. It talks about advancing offshore wind and clean energy, and Kai will talk about that more in her section. The Senate shortly thereafter passed an act driving climate policy forward, which is a much more comprehensive bill in that it addresses not just electricity, but also buildings and transportation. And it is an attempt to realize the requirement passed last year in the climate roadmap bill that Massachusetts reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. This is the Senate's sort of roadmap to actually get those emissions reduced. Just recently, each chamber nominated 3 of its members to come together in a conference committee to reconcile those 2 bills. So basically build one climate bill that both the Senate and the House can agree on by combining the House's bill from March and the Senate's bill from April. And that conference committee met for the first time last week. So they are just beginning the work of reconciling those 2 bills. And it's not exactly clear when they'll be done. It will be a detail heavy process, so it'll definitely take a couple of weeks. But it's clear from leadership that they want to move it before the end of the session so that there's time for the full House and Senate to vote and the governor to sign it into law. So the next 2 months are going to be very busy as that conference committee tries to piece together a final bill from the 2 that we've mentioned. A lot of our webinar today will focus on what is in those bills and what we think should make it through to a final climate bill. But we want to mention 2 other processes that are happening at the same time that are important to keep in mind. One is that our electric utilities, so National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil, have been engaged in a process at the Department of Public Utilities for I think a year. It's been a very long process where they basically proposed what they want to do for the next couple of years on grid modernization and on electric vehicles. And the process at the DPU has been a year of interveners like Green Energy Consumers asking questions, submitting testimony, and hoping to inform how the DPU will respond to these proposals from the electric utilities. So the final order from the DPU is expected sometime in June or early July, and that will have a huge impact on the state's ability to meet its greenhouse gas emissions goals, because it'll inform how the electric utilities can invest in a more resilient grid, but also in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And then secondly, the state is about to release its final clean energy and climate plan for 2025 and 2030. These are the state's plans for the strategies that will employ to meet the emissions reductions requirements of 2025 and 2030. The state recently issued a latest draft, and green energy consumers, along with lots of other advocates, have been giving feedback on that process for a long time. So that will also happen right around the same time as the legislative session comes to a close. So that is sort of the timeline context, and we'll talk about all of those pieces in a little bit more detail. But for now, I will turn it over to Kai to start us off with electricity.
Thank you, Anna. So today I'll be talking about the electricity and building sectors and how Massachusetts can reduce emissions from those two sectors. But I'd like to highlight one of the themes that Anna was just discussing, which is that there are many ways to adopt policy in Massachusetts that get us to our climate goals. This time of year in particular, there's a lot of focus on what the Massachusetts legislature is doing, because when bills pass, that's a really clear sign of movement in the right direction. However, administrative and regulatory advocacy and advocacy before the Department of Public Utilities can be just as impactful, even more so sometimes. In particular with electricity, I'm going to talk today about the Massachusetts Clean Energy Standard, which is a little known way to ratchet up the pace of decarbonization of our electric sector, and that is another process that's going on right now. We all know that although electricity is not the biggest source of emissions in Massachusetts, it's about 25%, which is a lot less than what we see from transportation, which is 40% or so, and building heating systems, which is about 30%. It's extremely important, and that's because to get our building and transportation sectors off of fossil fuels, we need to go deeply in electrifying them. To reduce emissions from an electrified building or electrified transportation, the electric system itself has to be powered on renewable energy. The best renewable source, of course, is we think of wind and solar, especially wind and solar that is sited locally and sustainably in areas that can take on that wind and solar. But there are a lot of other renewable or low carbon electric sources that are important to the conversation about electricity today. So we are talking about how fast Massachusetts can get to 100% renewable electricity. Two of the leading gubernatorial candidates most recently committed to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And I'm here to say that that is absolutely a doable goal for Massachusetts. And whether or not we have a clear path to achieving that goal right now, we should be thinking about getting to 100% as soon as possible. In fact, here in Rhode Island, I live in Rhode Island, we're voting on 100% renewable by 2033, a bill in the Senate to do that. That vote is happening today. Connecticut just committed to 100% renewable electricity by 2040. Meanwhile, Massachusetts doesn't have us getting to 100% renewable electricity until 2050, which we all know is not fast enough to meet our Global Warming Solutions Act goals. But increasing the Massachusetts Clean Energy Standard can help, and there is currently a common opportunity to do just that. I'll also touch briefly on the House and Senate climate bills, which talk a lot about offshore wind, and we absolutely will need rapid rollout and on-time development of offshore wind projects to achieve our renewable electricity goals. So Massachusetts has enough renewable supply to raise our standards of renewable electricity. There's kind of two sides to this 100% coin. First, we need to increase our requirements for renewable electricity. When we talk about the Renewable Portfolio Standard or the Clean Energy Standard, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about increasing the requirements on electricity suppliers to buy energy from renewable sources. Of course, there have to be renewable generating sources producing that renewable electricity for those electric suppliers to buy from. So just as we advocate for increasing the requirements on suppliers, we're also advocating for policy that can help bring more renewable generating capacity online. In the short term, we have a lot more renewable generating capacity than our requirements on those electric suppliers are. We have to be increasing these two things in step, because as we have more capacity, Massachusetts has done a really good job contracting for offshore wind to increase renewable generation supply. As we have that additional supply, we need to be increasing the buying power to make sure that there is value for that renewable energy and that we're actually utilizing it here in Massachusetts and taking credit for buying and using that renewable electricity in state. In this chart, you can see that we have a lot of Class 1 RECs coming online. That's those red bars. Most of that is from offshore wind, because Massachusetts, over the last couple of years, has done a good job legislatively pushing for more offshore wind procurements. And the purple line is our current requirement for Class 1 RECs. That is the type of renewable energy that is coming from these offshore wind projects. Starting in 2025, we will have more Massachusetts Class 1 RECs than we're utilizing in state, which means that if we're producing all of those RECs, but we don't increase the renewable portfolio standard, we're going to be exporting that renewable energy to other states like Rhode Island and Connecticut that have much higher renewable energy requirements. Massachusetts should increase its renewable energy standard and clean energy standard to soak up those RECs that are coming online that offshore wind is producing. And we can go to the next slide. Offshore wind should be developed rapidly and equitably. Just as we increase the requirements, we also want to see more offshore wind and faster. The House and the Senate, in their climate bills that passed this session, both of them had different suggestions on offshore wind. Green energy consumers tends to support more of the provisions in the House bill, but the Senate adopted a 10,000 megawatt offshore wind procurement requirement. That is significant. It would get us most of the way towards the amount of electricity that we need to meet our Global Warming Solutions Act goals to decarbonize all of our electricity. The conference committee is meeting right now, as Anna said, and we hope that they choose the best pieces of both the House and the Senate bills. One particular piece that I want to highlight is that we worked really hard to get an amendment to the House offshore wind bill that would open up offshore wind contracts to municipal aggregations and other non-utility off-takers. Currently, only a utility company is able to contract with an offshore wind project to get that good, affordable, clean offshore wind power. We think that municipal aggregations and other non-utility entities, in order to be more accessible, more equitable, should have similar opportunities to get offshore wind. We strongly support the amendment to the House bill introduced by Rep. Vitolo that would allow aggregations to benefit from offshore wind. Next slide, please. Now we'll move on to the clean energy standard. Massachusetts has a bunch of different standards and requirements for electric suppliers to purchase renewable energy. It's really confusing. It's really confusing for me. And this is my full-time job to be an advocate on this. One of the unfortunate side effects of all of these confusing and different types of requirements for renewable energy procurement on electric suppliers is that advocates don't know where to advocate, don't know how to advocate for increasing requirements for renewable energy. The clean energy standard we can think of as an umbrella. The renewable portfolio standard counts towards the clean energy standard. So where the renewable portfolio standard is, let's see, about 20% right now, the clean energy standard is higher than that, and the renewable portfolio standard requirements on electric suppliers count towards their clean energy standard requirements. Other types of renewable energy that do not count towards the renewable portfolio standard do count towards the clean energy standard. So for those of you who remember Governor Baker's plan to get hydropower from Canada to help power Massachusetts with clean renewable energy, that resource does not count towards the renewable portfolio standard because it's not local class 1 eligible, but it does count towards the Clean Energy Standard. For the purpose of meeting our Global Warming Solutions Act goals, we want to get to that 100% goal with as much renewable portfolio standard qualifying renewable energy as possible. However, in the short term, in this transition period, we do support increasing the clean energy standard to 100% because the more requirements we can have on delivering renewable energy, the more pressure there will be on the renewable energy market overall to deliver. So, for example, if our renewable portfolio, in the prior slides, you saw that we're going to have more offshore wind than the renewable portfolio standard can keep up with. Well, one thing we can do is increase the clean energy standard to above where those red bars were, above how much offshore wind RECs we'll have coming online. And those offshore wind RECs that don't need to be counted towards the renewable portfolio standard can be counted towards the clean energy standard instead. So we're soaking up those RECs, we're using those RECs in state, and they won't be exported out of state. That's the clean energy standard. We have a bit more of an explainer on our blog for anyone interested. We strongly suggest that folks send in comments to climate.strategies@mass.gov by a week from Friday, supporting that the clean energy standard be increased to 100% as soon as possible. This is a regulatory process that does not require legislative approval. It's within the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. The clean energy standard should do more. The current proposal for changing the regulations changes the clean energy standard from increasing, I think, 2% per year to up to 6% per year increases through 2030. But then it has it tapering it off to 1% per year. So let's keep that energy high. Let's get all the way to 100% as fast as possible. And let's go to the next slide. And the next slide will hopefully explain what I'm talking about a little bit better. So you can see the red bars here. That's the clean energy standard. It includes all of those bars below it. The blue bars are the RPS class 1. That's what offshore wind counts towards. That's what solar counts towards. The red bars is the amount of clean energy standard that is above the other types of requirements on electric suppliers that kind of fit into that clean energy standard umbrella. I'm not going to dig too much into this again because it's confusing, but as you can see, our clean energy standard is simply not pushing the market right now. In fact, in 2028 and 2030, the renewable portfolio standard is above the clean energy standard, which doesn't make any sense when you think of the fact that the renewable portfolio standard counts towards the clean energy standard. And the clean energy standard doesn't get us to 100% until 2050. We need that to change. We can go to the next slide. This is the current proposed changes to the clean energy standard. The current proposed changes to the clean energy standard would have the clean energy standard bumped up to get us closer to 100% earlier. But again, it doesn't get us to 100% until closer to 2050. And these green bars that sit on top of the clean energy standard, that's the clean energy standard E, or existing. That refers to generating resources that are clean, but they've been around for a long time. Again, they're not part of the new renewable energy market. That's what we're really trying to support. So we do not support increasing the CESE or using that as a way to get to our 100% goals. Let's get that red bar up to 100% as quick as possible. Anna did, so the next slide is about the fact that it's not just what type of electricity we're using. When we use electricity matters. Any of you who are members of our Shave the Peak program know this already because you get alerts in the summer on the hottest days when electric demand is the highest. On those hot days when electric demand is high, you also get the most polluting electric resources coming onto the grid. That can be coal or oil, and electric demand can be twice as high as during a normal day throughout the year. It's also the most expensive electricity. So we pay a lot as consumers for those peak electric demand days. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out the link here around Shave the Peak, and you can sign up to get alerts on those peak demand times as well. We need to go further than these Shave the Peak alerts though, and that's why we've been intervening in the Massachusetts DPU dockets, 2180 and 2181. These dockets would roll out smart meters to everyone in Massachusetts. Smart meters will enable us to track how much electricity we're using during peak times. It'll also enable incentivizing reductions on the peak due to time of use rates. And I'm sure that we'll have future webinars when there are new dockets to establish those time of use rates. And we'll go on to buildings. So to reduce emissions from the building sector, we have a few different strategies. The building sector is about 30% of emissions, but it's one of the areas in which we have the least clear path forward to reducing emissions. Electricity, it's simple. We increase that clean energy standard and that renewable portfolio standard as high as possible, and we make sure we have the offshore wind to bring that renewable electricity to Massachusetts. I'll say relatively simple. There's a lot of storage and other pieces that have to fit into that puzzle. Buildings, though, are really tough because Massachusetts has old building stock. We are a cold climate. We need a lot of building heat, and we're going to need a lot of retrofits to bring up our old building stock to the highly efficient and electrified buildings that could be run on renewable electricity and can reduce emissions in line with our Global Warming Solutions Act goals. The top requirement, so for new buildings, one of the best strategies is to adopt a net zero building code, which will avoid emissions coming from new buildings. Many of you probably saw that DOER, the Department of Energy Resources, ran a comment period earlier this spring on their proposed building code. This building code was not a net zero building code, as was required by the climate bill that passed last year in Massachusetts. And it's looking like the final building code that will be adopted by DOER is not as stringent as we would have liked to see to avoid emissions. So in the coming years, we're going to be working on other advocacy strategies to get a building code that reduces the amount of emissions coming from new buildings. At this point, we just can't afford to be building new buildings that are going to be run on fossil fuels and are going to be emitting carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions for the next coming years. An even bigger challenge is our existing buildings, because it's relatively cost effective and affordable to build a net zero new building, but retrofitting an existing building is expensive and difficult. We have two main strategies, whether it's a large building or a smaller building. For large buildings, we strongly support building energy reporting and performance standards. We'll talk about that in the next slide. For existing residential buildings, we're going to have to rely on and then greatly expand or revamp mass save to incentivize efficiency and electrification. The current climate bills that have been proposed do a little bit of work on buildings, but there's honestly not much in there, so that'll be a priority for the coming legislative session. Meanwhile, the Clean Heat Commission that the administration established has been meeting over the past couple of months, and we're all waiting to see what they recommend for that final CECP. You can go to the next slide. The climate bill that passed the Senate a few weeks ago requires building energy reporting. Building energy reporting requires large buildings to report their energy use and greenhouse gas emissions to a central database organized within the administration. This is really important. This is foundational to any emissions reductions work that we do for large existing buildings, because you can't really address a problem that we don't know how to track, that we don't fully understand. Once we pass building energy reporting, then we can move on to adopting building performance standards. In building performance standards, the regulating agency sets a declining limit on how much energy and emissions each type of building may use. This sets clear expectations for the building owners. It also helps adopt codes because folks are not going to want to build new buildings that are emitting a lot of fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions if they know that they'll have to reduce them over time to comply with the building performance standards. This is a policy that already exists in Boston. It's been proposed in Providence. It exists in New York and other regions around the country. Having building performance standards is one of the best strategies to reduce emissions from large buildings over time. Although building performance standards was not included in either the Senate or the House climate bills, only that reporting component was. We're hopeful that we can find another way to pass performance standards this session, because you do need the standards to provide the teeth to the reporting to make sure that we're actually reducing emissions over time. And that is the end of my slides, but happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you, Kai. Sorry for the accidental slide advancement when it wasn't appropriate. I am happy to jump back on to talk a little bit about transportation. And a sort of sneak peek is mostly I'll be talking about provisions in the Senate climate bill, but there's some other good stuff as well. So before I jump into the details of what is being proposed right now, we wanted to take a step back and look at what we actually need. So as Kai mentioned earlier, transportation is the largest sector source of greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts. It's about 42 or 43% of our greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to a huge contributor of all of the localized air pollution that we all are understanding more and more about how that impacts public health. So cleaning up the transportation sector is crucial to our ability to meet our 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirement, but it's also a matter of public health and therefore urgent for lots of reasons. The way that we at Green Energy Consumers see us tackling this sector is really with a two-pronged approach. So first, we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, through a combination of investing in walking and biking and public transit and shared mobility. And then we need to electrify any vehicles that are still on our roads. So there are lots of strategies that we can employ on this front, from setting a clear date by which we'll phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars, offering incentives for EV purchases and charging infrastructure. There's work we can do on rate design via time of use prices, and lots of stuff on EV infrastructure. So building codes, implementing charging corridors, really planning for this build out, and focusing on medium and heavy duty vehicles as well as light duty vehicles. There's also a portion in this diagram that is an overlap between the two, and that's where we get particularly excited. So that is, for example, prioritizing the electrification of transit buses, school buses, and commuter rail, as well as increasing access to e-bikes that can supplement or supplant some car trips. So big picture, we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled and we need to electrify everything. So now we'll dig into a little bit what exactly is in the Senate bill that can do some of these things. So starting with passenger vehicles, the Senate bill does one really monumental thing, which is set a date by which the state wants to phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars. So this was already a goal in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan draft. Massachusetts would phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035, but now it is in this legislation as well. The Senate climate bill also sets up an EV adoption incentive trust fund and funds it with $100 million. This is essentially an extension and an expansion of the existing More EV rebate program, with a couple of sort of key differences. It would extend the rebate to new and used vehicles, make it available for individual and corporate purchases, and continue to offer it for light duty vehicles as well as medium and heavy duty. The language maintains the $50,000 price cap for light duty vehicles, but increases the rebate from somewhere between $3,500 and $5,000 for light duty vehicles, and there is an adder for low or moderate income drivers. So that goes a long way towards making that rebate more accessible to more people. And then third in this bucket of incentivizing passenger vehicles, it calls for our electric utilities to offer off-peak charging rebates. So as Kai mentioned earlier, the cost of supplying electricity to an end-use customer varies throughout the day and throughout the year. So for the electric grid, it is really hard to provide you with an additional kilowatt hour of electricity on a weekend like this past weekend, where everybody in the whole region is running their air conditioners and demand is really high. And in contrast, it's much easier and cheaper for the electric grid to supply you with energy at night when it's cool, when demand is generally really low. So a really key strategy for managing the demand of electric vehicles on our grid is to incentivize EV drivers to charge when demand is lower. And one way to do that is to offer them a rebate. So if you charge at night, you might save 10 cents per kilowatt hour because you're shifting that load to a time that is better for the grid. We see this as a really key strategy because it's not a cross subsidy of any sort. It is just an accurate valuation of the cost of supplying electricity. And this provision made it into the Senate climate bill because of our work with Senator Jamie Eldridge, who filed an amendment that made it in, that not only calls for the electric utilities to implement an off-peak charging rebate, but specifically lists the benefits that they need to value when they calculate it. So right now, National Grid, for example, has an off-peak charging rebate, but it's very small because the only value that they're incorporating is the value of the supply costs. And the language in the Senate climate bill calls for supply, but also capacity, distribution, transmission, reliability, greenhouse gas, and public health benefits. If you count all of those, that means the discount will be larger or the rebate will be larger, which means it will do a better job of incentivizing people to actually charge off-peak, and it'll serve as an incentive for people to consider an electric vehicle over a gas-powered car because now their fuel costs are even lower. So we're excited about all three of these provisions on the passenger fleet side. As we all know, getting people into cars is one thing, but making sure that they have access to charging is a huge part of the puzzle to get our transportation emissions down over the next decade. The Senate climate bill does this in a couple ways. First, it calls for an interagency planning council so that the state can actually coordinate its efforts around the build out of charging infrastructure. This is maybe not as exciting as the Charging Deployment Trust Fund that I'll talk about in a minute, but this is really, really crucial because right now, each of the state agencies is sort of thinking about this in a silo. And so an example of this is that the Department of Public Utilities has been in this year-long process to look at the electric utilities plans for charging infrastructure. And the Department of Transportation is now tasked with spending the federal money coming down to build out the charging infrastructure in Massachusetts. And ideally, those two agencies would be talking to each other and coordinating and making sure that there's really one comprehensive approach to building out charging in Massachusetts. So this is a really key part of the Senate climate bill. In addition, as I mentioned just now, it sets up a charging deployment trust fund with $50 million to help accelerate the build out of charging infrastructure. It directs the Department of Transportation to build out charging along key travel corridors, so specifically at service plazas along the highway, but also at commuter rail stations and transit stations and ferry terminals. And finally, it amends the building code so that for major new buildings or major reconstruction, 10% of parking spaces must be EV ready. which means that they have electricity service built in, because it's much cheaper to lay the conduit and do the trenching that you need to do if you're already rebuilding a building than it is to rip up asphalt later and lay it down again. So all of these things are definitely progress on the charging front. We were glad to see that transit and fleets are also considered in the Senate climate bill, although we have some recommendations on this front that I'll talk about a little bit later. Key pieces related to public fleets. The Senate climate bill institutes a timeline for the electrification of the MBTA. So they say that all bus procurements have to be electric by 2028. And that the full bus fleet needs to be electric by 2040. Excuse me. It also directs the Department of Transportation to provide assistance to regional transit authorities so that they can build a rollout plan for electric buses in their fleets. Thanks to an amendment filed by Senator Brendan Crichton, there's also a provision that sets a timeline for the electrification of commuter rail, so that the commuter rail, there will be no new diesel purchases after 2030. There is language that calls for an initial report with recommendations about how to accelerate school bus electrification across the Commonwealth. And finally, it calls for the state to promulgate regulations of the greenhouse gas emissions of transportation network companies, or TNCs, which is basically companies like Uber and Lyft. What is missing? So we have a couple of thoughts on how this, the transportation provisions in the Senate climate bill can be strengthened. First, we think the scope of the Interagency Council on charging should be wider. So the language in the bill calls for it to focus on accessibility and reliability and the equitable distribution of charging infrastructure, and all of those things are needed. What we would add is that two things. One, that it also consider whether the infrastructure is adequate to support EV adoption at the rate that we need to meet our 2030 climate goals. And secondly, that it is explicitly not just look at light duty vehicles, but also medium and heavy duty vehicles, because if we want to build this infrastructure out efficiently, we really have to consider all use cases as we're planning. As I alluded to on the previous slide, we think that the Senate climate bill should include requirements for public fleet electrification. The Commonwealth really should be leading by example here, so we think there should be requirements around the electrification of vehicles owned by the state and also municipalities. One really key bullet is that we're really excited to see these aggressive timelines on the electrification of public transit. But it's really clear that transit agencies, both the MBTA and the RTAs, need funding to be able to meet those timelines. So that is a big gap that we would like to see filled in the final climate bill. And then this last point is a little bit of a nitpick, but it's on our list. The language around more EV or the EV incentive trust fund for medium and heavy duty vehicles limits the size of the rebate for vehicles in those class to, I believe, $6,000, which is simply too little for it to serve as an incentive for some of the more expensive heavy duty trucks. When the Department of Energy Resources built out More EV Truck, which is the existing rebate program for medium and heavy duty vehicles, they did a lot of research and a lot of work to size the rebate appropriately for each class of vehicle. So we would encourage the final version of the climate bill to allow for some flexibility on that front as the market changes. And as an example, the truck that you see on the left there is the first heavy duty vehicle that's fully electric in the Commonwealth. It's from a moving company called Intelligent Labor Moving based in Arlington. And they got a fully electric truck thanks to More EV Truck. And if that rebate had been sized in a way that is suggested in the current version of the climate bill, that wouldn't have been possible. So we need more flexibility on that front. And then again, there are parallel efforts happening at the same time. So everything that I just talked about was basically what is in the Senate climate bill that we support and hope makes it into the final climate bill this session, as well as those recommendations on the previous slide. But at the same time, we're waiting for the final plan for the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. The latest draft of that plan that was shared by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs showed that the state thinks that we need 900,000 electric vehicles on the road in place of gas cars by 2030 in order to be on track to reduce emissions 50% by 2030. So there are about 5.5 million cars on the road in Massachusetts. Currently around 40 or 50,000 are electric vehicles, and we need to accelerate the rate of adoption real quick to reach 900,000 EVs by 2030. So elements in the Senate climate bill will start, but clearly this is going to need continued attention throughout the rest of the decade. The second point on the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that I wanted to make was that when the first draft of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan came out, a lot of advocates, green energy consumers included, were disappointed to see that there was mostly focus on electrification and nothing on reducing vehicle miles traveled. So we fully support all the strategies to accelerate EV adoption. It's really clear we need that, but we cannot forget that we also need to support and expand public transit and electrify public transit and biking and walking and all of that. So we were heartened to see that the administration took those comments to heart. The latest draft of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan does include a target to reduce overall vehicle miles traveled 7% by 2030. That's something that we're all going to need to dig into to make possible, but that is one key development on the CECP front. And then secondly, I just want to briefly touch on the DPU dockets on electric vehicles. National Grid and Eversource proposed a whole lot of interventions on the electric vehicle front. Mostly they want to expand the existing make-ready programs through which they offer, they cover the costs of bringing infrastructure to the charging pad so that the site host only has to actually buy the unit and install it and is not responsible for the costs of running a line or trenching or any of that. That has been a really key strategy for building out charging infrastructure up until this point, and now the electric utilities really want to expand it. This is something we've been engaged on for the past year, and as I mentioned at the beginning, right now we're just waiting to see what the DP will actually order. But fear ye not, when that happens, we'll have a webinar on it so that we all know what to expect from our electric utilities in the next couple of years. So to sum that all up, there are a couple of ways that you can get involved. And Kai, did you want to talk about the conference committee, or should I just keep going? I'll keep going.
Happy to.
Oh, go for
it. We've already kind of introduced this in our first timeline slide, but the conference committee will be meeting for the next couple of weeks. As many of you will know, in Massachusetts, when the House and the Senate pass different bills, which happens quite often, a conference committee is appointed, 3 legislators from each chamber, and that conference committee is up to them to meet among the 6 of them to figure out what's going to go in the final version of the bill that gets passed. At this point, it won't receive, this is kind of the final chance for folks to advocate for what they want to see. What we're hearing is that what will likely be in the final bill is a mix of both, and if an element of policy was in one of the bills, it has a good chance of being included in the final bill. However, there will be lots of negotiations that go on before it is finalized and sent to the governor. We do encourage folks to call their own legislators. So if you don't know your legislator, you can find that online. You can find their contact information as well and call for your legislator to urge the conference committee members to adopt key components that were in one of the bills, like building energy reporting, the Offshore Wind Amendment that enables Mass CEC to let aggregations, to work with aggregations to get the benefits of offshore winds, as well as the Senate EV bill components that Anna mentioned in her presentation. As a note, we encourage you to call your own legislator and ask them to talk to the conference committee members, unless of course you happen to be in the district of one of those conference committee members. That's because legislators really do listen more to their constituents, and your legislator will be your best advocate in getting what you want to see in that final bill. And I'll pass it back to Anna to discuss what else you can do. Although first, actually, I'll mention that we do request that you send in comments to the climate.strategies@mass.gov email address by a week from Friday, calling for a 100% clean energy standard. And back to you, Anna.
Thanks, Kai. I will just add that we are hoping to get letters to the editor in local newspapers across the state to really drive home the point that any climate bill has to include transportation and really tackle that sector if we want to reach our 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So we have a little one-sheeter with some information about that I'll share after this webinar by email. But secondly, there is a bill that explicitly addresses the electrification of public fleets, which was the one piece that we think is really missing from the Senate's approach to transportation. There is a bill that actually addresses that is currently in the Transportation Committee, and it has been extended to June 3rd. So basically the committee is taking the time from now until then to deliberate, and what we want them to do is favorably report that bill out to indicate that there really is support for the electrification of public fleets. So one relatively easy task is to reach out to your legislator, as Kai mentioned earlier, and urge them to support that bill, and we'll send information in the follow-up email about how to do that as well. So lots of opportunities to engage right now, and there will certainly be more between now and the end of the session. With that, I think we can turn to Q&A. So there are many questions in the chat, and I think Kai and I can just take turns responding to them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before 1. But if you have any further questions, you can reach out to us at the emails on the slide. So Kai, if you have a question already that you want to address, go for it. Otherwise, I'm going to take a moment and review them.
I am actually not able to see the Q&A, so you're going to have to do the honors.
Okay, then I will lob you some. Okay, there was one question for clarification around the Vitolo Amendment. Could you clarify whether it got passed and incorporated into the House bill?
Yes, great question. It was passed, which we're happy to see. For a little bit of clarification, additionally, what the amendment does is it makes sure that Mass CEC, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, can be the backing entity to back up aggregations and non-utility entities, and make sure that they have the buying power and the stability to enter those long-term contracts with offshore wind. And it was in the House bill, Rep. Vitolo's amendment. I don't remember what number, but because it was adopted in the final House climate bill, you can just refer to it as the Mass CEC provision with offshore wind and aggregations.
Okay, there is a question about whether there are any provisions for helping low-income households switch to an electric car, i.e. households where the max affordability for a car is $10,000 or less. So this is something that we think about a lot at Green Energy Consumers, because we really want this technology and the benefits of lower fuel costs and lower maintenance costs to be available to everyone. Right now, it is just impossible to find a used electric car for less than $10,000. The impacts of the chip shortage and the coronavirus over the last 2 years have made car prices just go through the roof, and that is true both on the new front and the used front. So right now, finding a used electric vehicle is challenging. There are not very many, and the ones that are available are definitely start around $20,000, unless we're talking about a very old Nissan Leaf or something like that. So we're kind of supporting, or our response to this is to do lots of different things at the same time. So we need more new electric vehicles to get on the road in Massachusetts, so that supply of used electric vehicles can exist 1 or 2 years from now. So that's why it's an indirect impact, but increasing the sale of new vehicles will help bolster that used market. This is why we intervened in the dockets at the Department of Public Utilities while we wait for the market to hopefully sort itself out and those prices to come down. We need to make sure that we're building charging infrastructure in a way that makes it possible for people who have a smaller budget for a vehicle to also get access to charging, whether that means covering some of the costs of installing charging at home, or implementing programs that make it easier to install charging if you live in an apartment or a multi-unit dwelling in the lingo of the EV dockets. So that is all sort of part of our approach to that. But that is also a big part of why we want to focus on medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification. When we talk about the benefits of electric vehicles, there's the lower fuel costs and lower maintenance, but these environmental and particularly public health benefits are huge. We did a webinar earlier this spring, or really late winter, about medium and heavy duty vehicles in particular, which have a enormously outsized impact on public health. I think if I remember the numbers off the top of my head, they're like 7% of the vehicles on the road, but responsible for half of the particulate matter and NOx and SOx emissions that are contributing to asthma and emphysema and all sorts of awful public health harms. So that's part of why we want to bring in public fleet electrification, why we want the public transit to move faster, why we want school buses to move faster. So we really want to push on all of these fronts so that the benefits can be distributed and so that people are ready to take advantage when the vehicle prices come down. So I hope I answered that question, because it is definitely one we think about a lot. Kai, there is a question about grid modernization in general. So the question is, what is your view on the status of grid modernization? Does either of the bills in the current conference committee include grid modernization? Increasing offshore wind capacity without grid modernization would be a waste of resources.
Thanks, Anna. Good question. So yes, the House bill does contain some grid modernization elements tied in with the House offshore wind components. And this is we've spent a lot of time researching and digging into, but we are part of the ACES coalition, which supported the Grid Modernization Council and plan contained in that House bill. Agreed that we need to update our grid as we bring more renewable energy online, because otherwise we will start to see curtailment of renewable energy. But grid modernization brings a number of other benefits like outage resilience and better planning for how we can manage different power flows, especially with two-way power flows, more solar, more electric vehicles on the grid. The grid modernization docket did not do enough. It did extend and expand existing investments into some key grid modernization technologies, like grid-facing efficiency technology that can increase the efficiency of the grid, because electric grid systems actually do lose a lot of the power between when it is generated and when it arrives at your house. We have really been focused on the smart meter components of those grid modernization dockets and less so on the grid facing investments because we are a consumer advocacy organization, and smart meters are one of those ways that consumers are going to be directly interfacing with renewable energy and the grid. So that's where we have plugged in. And I do think that there are other organizations like Acadia Center that has done a lot more in grid modernization that could probably speak better to whether the components of the House and Senate climate bills are sufficient for what we'll need in the coming years.
Great. We'll just ping pong between topics. So there's a question on the transportation front asking whether the MBTA timeline for the electrification of public fleets applies to other regional transit authorities like Pioneer Valley Transit Authority or BRTA. The answer is no. So that provision in the Senate climate bill is very focused on the MBTA. There was a standalone bill earlier in the session that focused on public transit electrification that set one timeline for the MBTA and then a second timeline for regional transit authorities that was basically 5 years behind the MBTA timeline. I know that there's lots of appetite to electrify regional transit authorities, and quite honestly, some of them are further ahead than the MBTA. The Pioneer Valley Transit Authority and Martha's Vineyard both have electric buses. And Martha's Vineyard in particular is moving much faster than the MBTA. So the final sort of language in the Senate climate bill talks about building a rollout plan and support for RTAs, but the very date-driven timeline is just for the MBTA. A question for you, Kai. Offshore wind, does that just benefit people who are on the coast, or are there benefits for central and western Mass as well?
Offshore wind will absolutely benefit everyone in Massachusetts for a number of ways. We can categorize offshore wind benefits into economic benefits and ratepayer economic benefits in particular. So we'll have access to cheaper renewable electricity. Offshore wind contracts are coming in as the least expensive new power option for getting new supply onto our grid. There's obviously the renewable electricity benefits. This is a benefit for meeting our climate goals, but also for air pollution. Bringing more renewable supply into the region is going to help us phase out polluting natural gas, coal, and oil power plants throughout the region. I think the answer that will get at your question best is clarifying that we are on a regional electricity grid here in New England. So when we turn on our lights anywhere in New England, we can be getting electrons from anywhere in New England. However, based on the physics of electricity, when you turn on your lights, you are more likely to be getting electricity from a generator closer to you. That said, energy markets and procurement tend to work either at the state level or the regional level. So offshore wind built anywhere in the region is going to benefit you no matter where you're located. It will benefit you even more if the offshore wind is contracted from Massachusetts and you live in Massachusetts. So I've discussed those benefits of local air pollution, phasing out other fossil fuels, meeting our climate goals. That's a benefit. It's more affordable, clean electricity. There's also the economic benefits of creating a lot of good green jobs within state. And then there are the economic benefits of producing more of our electricity in Massachusetts. Right now, we export a lot of money to other states because we're buying all of that fossil fuels from other states. Offshore wind is created here. It's going to be more reliable and less volatile pricing long-term than fossil fuels. As we have seen, fossil fuels are really volatile. They depend on global political conditions and more, and switching to offshore wind is going to help us have greater security in our energy supply going forward.
Okay, we are right at 1 o'clock. So I have one last question for you, Kai, that hopefully will be a quick yes or no. and then we'll have to wrap it up. The question is, does the Senate bill include provisions for incentivizing home energy improvements for insulation, windows, and or heating and cooling?
I believe that the Senate included maybe a little bit about Mass Save. I don't think it included anything specific on those incentives. For those incentives, you'd really want to look to the Mass Save plan that was just approved for 2022 through 2024. I don't know for sure though, so would have to get back to you on that one.
We'll add that to the long list of things to put in a follow-up email. So thank you very much, all of you, for sticking with us for over an hour now. We hope that you have a better sense of what's going on in Massachusetts now than you did an hour ago. We will definitely send out a follow-up email that has a recording of this webinar, the slides, and instructions in a little bit more detail on the different ways to get engaged. I know we've been getting a lot of questions in the chat about exactly who to email and how and what should we say, so we'll make sure to write that all out. But thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you at another event soon.